Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's IAQ Matters online workshop, how to utilize test data for HVAC planning to develop 5 to 10-year strategies for restoration and replacement. I'm Troy Raszka, and I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications for WTI Pure Air Control Services. And with me today, I have Frank Santini and Karl Stefan. Go ahead and introduce yourselves, gentlemen. Frank, I think you're on mute.
It looked good though, Frank.
Thank you, Troy. Great way to start the presentation here. This is Frank Santini from Pure Air Tremco.
Karl Stefan, Pure Air Tremco as well.
Yeah, so guys, we're here today to talk about how to utilize HVAC assessments to manage an inventory of equipment to develop strategies for restoration, replacement, and maintenance of these systems. And so I'd just like to welcome everyone today, and I would ask that you put your questions into the question tray, and we will have a Q&A time at the end of today's workshop to go over these questions. Of course, if we miss one, you can always email us. Our contact information will be at the end of the webinar as well. We also have handouts in the handout tray, so you can download a copy of the slide deck, as well as some information sheets on the topics that we're going to cover today. So let's dive right in. So today we're going to be looking at a number of topics that will take you through the importance of knowing the conditions of your HVAC inventory and then developing plans to bring them up to speed, especially with all of the IAQ and ventilation concerns that the pandemic has put into light. So today we're going to talk about what a run to fail strategy is, and it really isn't much of a strategy at all. And then we're going to take a look at these type of mechanical inventory assessments from the perspective of facility management, asset managers, and then of course any C-suite or executive stakeholders in your organization. Then we're going to dive right into what it looks like to actually assess and test this equipment. And we're going to cover the various types of things that are reported in the report that we hand over after testing the equipment. And then we'll look at current state versus future state and how prescriptive planning and prescriptive solutions will help you ultimately gear you towards successful outcomes. Then of course we'll follow it up with some questions and answers. So when we start to talk about HVAC equipment, mechanical equipment, and building maintenance, all too often, and of course over the many years that we've been doing this, indoor air quality and HVAC, we've found that many facilities, many organizations operate on what's called a deferred maintenance program, where they're doing just the minimum to keep the equipment running, putting out fires, doing the very minimum to keep the equipment running, which is also referred to as a run to fail strategy, which I said earlier is not much of a strategy at all. Most people think they're saving money this way, but in reality, it's actually costing them more in the long run. And so when we look at that savings, well, I'm saving $1 today. Well, it's going to cost you $4 in the future for what you're putting off, right? And even NASA, as they're preparing to go to Mars and they're developing equipment that has to last many, many years, they even say that if you're running to fail, that you're going to have a 30% shorter equipment lifespan. So if you have HVAC equipment whose lifespan is normally 25, 30 years and you're not doing anything to keep it properly maintained, you're not going to get that kind of lifespan at all out of it. And of course, you know, the big things is that running to fail and putting this type of equipment into these deteriorated conditions, you know, it impacts indoor air quality, which can lead to sick building syndrome, hospital-acquired infection if you're a healthcare facility, and even be a detriment to occupant cognitive function. You know, not to mention energy efficiency of the equipment itself, repair costs, and maintenance costs. So that's what we're here to talk about today, is how do we take a look at where our equipment is and how do we get to where we want to be by using scientific and engineering data to build a plan.
Troy, a
And
couple
so-
notes on that slide.
Yeah, go right ahead, Frank.
And not to make this too, getting too academic about this, but go to the article from a gentleman named Andy Page from Maintenance World a couple years back. I'll quote from one of his articles here. And I quote, "The majority of failure modes for any given asset are a function of how the machine is treated and not a function of how old the asset is. Quite simply put, a well-treated asset will have a lower failure rate than an ill-treated asset, regardless of age." And anybody who's in the audience now, it's been in one of my live presentations, they know I like to reference the Tom Brady analogy, where we think about the superstar quarterback who's playing at age 45 now, and most quarterbacks are done by the time they're 37, 38 years old, but he's been able to last because he's taking care of himself in that sense. And so we look at that same analogy as it relates to taking care of our equipment, and specifically in this case, are taking care of our air handlers. And age isn't always a deciding factor. In fact, it's a minimal factor compared to how the asset's actually treated and maintained.
No, that's a terrific point, Frank. And really, when we're looking at this run to fail approach, and again, Pure Air Control Services has been at this for over 30 years. So we've literally been in tens of thousands of air handler units. And this right here is just a smattering of pictures, from the last couple of years. And these are very common conditions we see across inventories, across a variety of types of buildings and uses, from healthcare to schools to higher education, military bases, commercial facilities. It's not exclusive to one type of building and use. And so that's why we get to this point, and we always ask, do you have an operation and maintenance manual for your HVAC equipment? And as you know, Frank and Karl and I have done quite a few of these workshops, and even recently about the ASHRAE standard for operations and maintenance of HVAC. So we're not going to deep dive it today, but it's a legitimate question to ask. Do you just have an inventory of the nomenclature and the age of equipment, or do you actually know what's going on with that inventory besides emergency maintenance calls? And so we just sort of show this to wake everybody up and to have them take a look at the things that we see every single day. So, guys, when we look at, these kind of conditions on this type of equipment, and we start to lay out a plan for coming alongside these facilities and helping them develop a testing protocol and a reporting protocol to actually make a more complete HVAC or mechanical inventory so that they can start planning. Let's look at these stakeholders, maybe one by one, stakeholders that each have their own special interest where it comes to the mechanical equipment and building these types of assessments and plans, and then two, aligning these types of people so that they come in alignment and we're all working together to improve the equipment and ultimately the conditions of the building for the occupants that reside, work, and learn in these buildings. So what's in it for me, the facility manager? Frank, Karl, you guys both deal with a lot of guys in the field. So why don't you sort of take us through this methodology of getting in some of these guys' head? And I'm sure that many of you today might fit in one of these three categories of folks that we deal with when we talk about helping with these type of assessments.
Well, one thing, Troy, when you have the data of, in this case, your HVAC equipment, and you're going out there and you're being deliberate about capturing that data and doing the inspections, I think the thing that stands out, number one, is that you're going to catch issues that you can address immediately because they should be addressed immediately. I can think of a few examples. We had a hospital in the Southwest, which during one of our inspections, we found that the final filter, the HEPA filter, which served a very critical area in that patient care area in that particular hospital, was filled with the mold. I mean, visibly filled with mold. And so upon the inspection, our inspector immediately told the facilities team so they could get that final filter changed. And it just had gone unnoticed from just lack of inspections by that particular healthcare facility. Another example would be, we've seen a situation where you have internal insulation inside of an air handler, and it starts to come away from the internal walls of the air handler, and then eventually reaches a point where it totally comes off the wall or comes off the floor, and then is blocking the coil because the air is flowing through the coil, and it becomes actually an obstruction of airflow through the coil. And so that's something that we come across quite a bit in these single wall air handlers that have this internal insulation that's just come off after years and years of deterioration. Karl, I think you wanted to mention something on this end as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, talk about critical maintenance and stories to share. I'll never forget one where high-rise building, a lot of air handlers, a lot of floors, and one of the floors has discharge out of the supply duct. Pieces of material fall down on our desks. What's the knee-jerk reaction? Okay, get in there and clean the ductwork. And months later, that discharge happens again. So we get a call, we come in and we're looking, and first thing I do is start looking at the ductwork, and I see this debris scatter, and I look at the duct otherwise and say, wow, it was a good job, a good cleaning. Has VAVs in there. VAVs look good, just again, settled debris. I go back to the air handler, and it's in there that I find, a kind of a tough to access location where there's sound attenuation. And what happened is, over time, debris built up in the sound attenuation area where you have these little holes, little gap, perfect spot for debris to accumulate. Well, you also have a dark, damp environment. So what happens is fungal spores get on there, they start to grow, eat that debris, and they grow. And what I found was the fungal growth was grown to a certain threshold above the sound attenuation, breaking off and going downstream. But what happened in turn is, unfortunately, the owners had to redo the ductwork cleaning, but include the air handler this time. And I explained to them, I said, you guys have a lot of air handlers on a lot of floors. Rather than just immediately, if something comes out of the duct, go right in there and clean. It's going to be critical going forward that you start to get all these units assessed and inventoried, because this may not be the last time this happens. Let's get you a plan together, because you ended up coming back and re-cleaning and putting a lot of money into this when, if we prioritized, again, that critical maintenance and what other issues would be found in the air handler, also causing other issues, clogged coils, some drain pan leakage, we could be ahead of this and stop a lot of these problems before they occurred.
Karl, and there's also situations we see where the facilities team at some point in the past, could have been recently or years ago even, has band-aided something. And again, this is not an indictment of our facilities colleagues. This is, you're trying to do a great job, and you got to make things work on the fly sometimes. But we've seen situations upon doing these assessments and inspections, for example, fire dampers being held up by pieces of wood in the ductwork instead of being held up by the fusible links that they're supposed to be held up by. Obviously, they probably did that with the intention of going back and fixing that situation, but who knows how much time went by with the firewood holding up the fire dampers instead of the proper fusible link. And then, of course, the situations we see pretty commonly is the closure of dampers. We just had one of our test and balance assessors doing an inspection, and pretty large unit, kind of unit that is taller than he was, and he had to use his foot to open the door of the air handler because the suction was so great, the pressure. And he found out that for this particular unit, where it had a return fan and a supply fan, that the entry of the discharge in the return section, that damper was closed off, and the outside air damper was closed off. So the unit was just starving for air, creating all that pressure that forced them to have to really struggle to get the air handler open. So you see those kinds of things through these inspections that the facility manager can address immediately, because those are problems that you can easily address, and they just know this through lack of inspection or because they were band-aided and never went back to look at those things.
That's amazing. I mean, if you think about it, And again, with our breadth of experience, we see many of these things or variations of this time and time again. I mean, the only thing I would add before we maybe start talking about going up chain from facilities is that we hear time and time again that I just don't have the budget for that, or I'm short staffed. And using the data and the survey that is done of the inventory really does help to make a third-party justification for facilities to be able to set a plan or a cadence to actually start to address these things. And of course, because of the pandemic, all of this has been put into the spotlight: outside air ventilation, better filtration, and such. So, you know, these type of plans really help facility management justify and make a plan to move forward. When we kind of go up immediately up chain, you know, as far as when we're looking at an entire inventory and we're not just putting out fires, you know, on single onesie twosie units, air handler units, but when we're really looking at, let's say, a large hospital and there's 55 air handler units, and starting to actually prioritize the needs of these units based on a number of factors, which we'll show you here in a little bit. But what's in it for the asset manager, or maybe the finance director that's looking at these pieces of equipment as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, you start thinking about each individual person in the organization goals and who they have to answer to, and what makes him or her look good. You know, obviously for an asset manager, it's trying to extend the life of equipment, spending less funds, you know, increasing that bottom line every single year. You know, going back to the Page article I mentioned earlier from Maint World, you know, one problem identified in that particular piece was, and I quote, "Many asset managers choose the easier route of buying a new asset rather than changing the behaviors of their personnel to force a higher grade care for their assets." In other words, better preventive maintenance. You know, that's something that is unfortunately pretty common in the facilities we see. We have, you know, less funds devoted to PM, more funds available for capital to replace. But if you think about, you know, life cycle cost models, there's a lot to be said, as you saw in some of those statistics earlier in the slide that Troy showed from NASA and from some other academic and business authorities, that, you know, just looking at purchase price of new assets isn't really the way to look at it. You have to look at the entire life cycle cost model to help you make decisions about whether to replace or do a better job of maintaining or rebuilding or refurbishing. So all that can play a part, you know. But when you do the types of things that we're talking about in this particular presentation, this workshop, which is gather data on HVAC systems and assess, you really can make better decisions because you have the data to make those type of decisions. One example I think that Karl can talk about is a situation where, you know, another situation in which we had some particulate emanation from ductwork, and we discovered a source that wasn't the source that the client initially thought it was. Go ahead, Karl.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it. Speaking of justifications, I mean, I spoke with this client. Again, I completely understand the knee-jerk reaction, right? Something's coming out of our ductwork. Now we're talking about a central sterile process. We're talking about a critical area. So immediately, hey, come in, give me the solution, you know, get it cleaned, get everything cleaned up. I said to him, well, wait a minute. You know, you have multiple air handlers all feeding this area. You have a significant amount of ductwork in the end. Rather than rush in and do all this cleaning, let's go through the system real quick and take a look and identify where is our source. Let's get that source and then come up with a plan to clean or remediate. And so when we did that, what we found was kind of a flip-flop of my previous example. The air handlers were in good condition. The supply plenum was in good condition. The ductwork leading up to the VAVs was in good condition. It was at the VAVs where we had degradation of fiberglass coming into the space. That was kind of the root cause for a lot of this. But, you know, again, why I wanted to do this first was the cost to do this entire air conveyance system cleaning versus the cost to assess and then clean VAVs on was still less than the total cost could have been. So a great way to say, hey, yeah, I paid a few dollars up front. I took a little longer to get the answer, but in the end, I've saved X dollars that can be used elsewhere, and it's still addressed this problem. So one of the really, a great example I like to share, because it just shows the benefit of taking a step back real quick, getting an assessment done to narrow down all the potential sources and problems, and then addressing them.
That's a great analogy. And again, it's somewhat of our mantra around here is that, how can you manage what you don't measure, right? And so that's what we're talking about here is letting the data do the talking, and then having these team members within facility management and operations, right, align and then make the right call based on the data. And again, as Frank said earlier, this type of data, just because an air handler is 30 years old, 40 years old, doesn't mean it needs to be replaced. If you're just going on a calendar year and it's coming up and, hey, it's 30 years old, let's just rip them all out and replace them. I mean, a lot of times that isn't feasible even down the road, especially with the disruption it might cause a facility to try to do it. So you're going to be doing it in stages anyways, even if you're slating assets for replacement. Wouldn't it be nice to have this type of reporting and planning to say, okay, we can stage what actually needs to be replaced out, and in the meantime, clean and restore equipment to add that many more years of lifespan onto that asset. So I think it's a really great tool to take and look at the inventory at large, and then really start to categorize it. And then finally, we move on and we really look at the upper level management or the C-suite or executive level. It could be a board of directors at a hospital or a school board, right, that's looking at this stuff. And so, what's in it from that level? Now that you have the two lower levels of facility management, asset management working together. Frank, what would you say is some of the biggest takeaways for the executive?
Yeah, I think, obviously a lot of things we're talking about here are benefits for all the different levels of the facility. But I think that you think through the financial story you can tell. A lot of the examples we've been given are kind of reactive situations, as we have particulate coming on the vents, or what we found from immediate resolutions we can make when we do initial inspections. But really the key to the data you gather is the long-term key, the 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years down the road, and the financial implications of trying to avoid costly replacements, maintain better, and refurbish what you can. And that becomes a really attractive financial story for the CFO and the president and the board of directors or trustees, or what have you. And now all that data comes to fruition because you've broken it all down. You've assessed the criticality of the condition of your HVAC systems, the worst and the ones that are okay, and the ones in the middle, and also the criticality of where they fit in terms of the organization. You look at different factors that play a part in what's important to your organization. Is the area served by that particular air handler of strategic importance? What does function? The classic example in healthcare is it a supporting service, that does not have anything to do with patient safety, or is it something that's a life support service? What's the physical risk to that area based on the condition of the air handler? Is it in such bad shape there's actually a physical risk to patients, or is it just merely a minor comfort due to temperature? What's the utilization level of the area served by that air handler? Is it 24/7, or is it 9 to 5, Monday through Friday? How critical is the area generally? Is it off-site, outpatient, or is it an ICU or cath lab or something along those lines? And what kind of critical medical devices, again, in the healthcare example, may be present in that area that can't afford to have fluctuations in temperature or humidity? So you take all this data you've gathered, not only on the assets themselves, but also the purpose that they're ultimately serving in terms of the function in that area of the particular facility. And then you put all that into a financial story, which we'll get into more in these next few slides. And then the executive team and the board of directors can really make much more sound financial decisions in the long run to be able to prevent emergency replacements and also sustain and extend their budgets through great planning and great maintenance, and also where appropriate, repair and refurbishment.
Great point, Frank. You know, one thing to add to that too, I know I keep hitting these VAVs, but you know, one of the indirect results that kind of came out of our assessment recently is, hey, you have similar make and model VAVs serving other critical areas. What happens when they start to degrade, right? So now that executive team has an idea, hey, we should start planning for this, right? We should start identifying these other areas that are critical. We should start thinking about reviewing the plans, seeing how many VAVs we have, and making a plan for going through these, because functionally they're fine. It's just an age and hygiene thing. So by coming up with this plan, they can now start to put some assets together towards it, have something in place, rather than, just like you put it, Frank, waiting and all of a sudden, hey, here's another critical area now and we have something coming out. Maybe we have to shut it down for who knows how long until it's resolved. So, you know, great point about being able to plan ahead. I think it's just so critical with anything HVAC like this.
No, that's exactly right, guys. I mean, if you think about it at the executive level, you know, you're on the board of directors or trustees for a large university. There's a main campus, and there might be up to five satellite campuses in different cities and locations. And every single one of those campuses has multiple buildings with multiple air handler units. And these type of assessments, if you start to undertake them and knock them down building by building across your campuses, will paint a very large, detailed picture of all of this equipment across all of these buildings and campuses, or healthcare, right? You might be a healthcare network that has hundreds of hospitals all over the country, and each one of those hospitals has 50 air handler units on it. You know, now what? I mean, now you have the ability to really look out 5 or 10 years with this data set, and perhaps some ongoing check-ins on the data set, and start to create plans. So that said, let's dive right into what these type of assets actually are. Now that you know the implications and why these type of assessments are important and how they can benefit you, let's actually get into what they are and sort of how we do them and what makes us different than perhaps just a regular T&B company or a mechanical engineer. So I know, Karl, you started out here and are still very closely integrated into our building sciences team, and who primarily goes out and inspects these kind of units. Why don't you take us through what an HVAC hygiene and performance assessment actually is?
Sure, thanks, Troy. It's essentially what we're trying to do with an HVAC hygiene assessment is take the inventory of air handlers in a building. Each and every one of those will be assessed. And when they're assessed, what that means is we're going in and we're looking at all the compartments and areas that make up that air handler. And we're reviewing those visually. We may be collecting environmental samples to help justify our visual findings, and even include performance testing to see how those different areas are performing and how the unit as a whole is performing. So we're really getting a detailed profile of these air handlers. And this doesn't just include the air handler, it can include the supply plenum, the return plenum, as I said earlier, ductwork, inline systems, really hitting these air conveyance systems in their entirety. And we use that assessment for each one of these units. We pull together an overall score and report on them and present them. So two things come out of this. There's an overall unit score and then a breakdown of what actually leads to our score and our recommendations. And in turn, that report that contains all this information allows, you know, the client, the facility manager, the asset manager, et cetera, to then essentially have a plan in place for each one of these units, whether it's one or two small items, nothing at all, to replacement and everything in between. Items like general maintenance, restoration, which we'll get into. So, you know, the goal of these assessments is not just kind of looking at this from one angle, but multiple angles to really truly profile a unit.
That's a great point. You know what? And when we talk about these assessments, and we've been talking about them pretty generally as we've been moving through this workshop, Obviously, the larger assessment is made up of a bunch of very detailed different types of assays and tests that we will go through, the equipment depending on type, use, age, and compile all of this data into the sort of overarching report. So guys, why don't you sort of maybe quickly take us through some of the differences between, as we drill down into these assessments, the different types of tests or inspections that we do.
Yeah, I think, Troy, that you have to think about this too, like from a high level. The important things about these assessments before you dig down into the pieces is, number one, you're gathering the data properly. In other words, do you have an eye for the hygienic aspect of what's dirty and what's clean? If you want to understand truly the microscopic level in terms of the type of hygiene that's going on in the surface of the drain pan or the blower or the coil, do you have the right certifications to make sure you're gathering the sample properly and having it analyzed in the laboratory? Do you have the procedures in place so you don't miss anything? It's a lot of air handlers in a given location. You want to make sure you're following the right procedures so nothing's missed. Even the photograph taking is a thing that is kind of say, oh, it's snap the photograph, but you want to make sure you snap the type of photographs that are going to actually capture the actual condition of the component part of the unit you're looking at, and not just be a useless photograph that it can't be used later on when you're really trying to actually take the data you've gathered and use it properly. And then things of how is the data stored then? Is it stored on the proper platform, or some kind of document that we can actually review it, share it, organize it easily? So those kinds of things are important, and also utilizing the data in the future properly, which goes to how it's stored. Can the data be retrieved and then the right data points assessed to make strategic decisions based off of that data? And of course, also making sure all the right things are gathered, not just on the component part conditions and hygiene, but also location and access. As I mentioned before, what's the area it's served? How difficult is it to access that particular unit? So all those play a part in this. And then you can get into things of, hey, when you're looking at the air handler, you're not only looking at it from a hygienic perspective, as Karl mentioned, but also from the performance perspective. Before I get into that, though, I want to let Karl jump in.
Yeah, Frank, you put it well there. Again, kind of in the other slide, I was saying that it's multiple angles, which means you have a team of people with different backgrounds that are able to come together to put this, pull this all together. And it's important. It really is. The hygiene being specialized there, being specialized in performance, and having that combined as one allows you to then really take this, again, this assessment and this ability to really break down all these different features. But one thing I like to mention with these is, we look at hygiene and photographs and performance, but what about some of the little things that happen when we do these assessments or when these assessments are done, right? We just talked about all the units, right? Well, I can't tell you how many times I've run into what I call a Joe situation. We come into the building and I'm talking to the facility director and manager. I said, well, I got all this stuff. My main HVAC guy, Joe, yeah, he knows where all the units is, but he's not here today. And well, what happens if Joe isn't there? He retires, or goodness forbid something happens. A lot of times we see that, and we see mechanical plans are extremely difficult to find, right? How many you can relate? You have a room with a huge rolled up mechanical plans. Yeah, I don't know where that was. When was that addition? Right? These are all over the place. So we come in and we ask, and nobody can really find it. So one of the things we like to do that happens a lot is, let's find a way to make there be more than one Joe, or let's find a way to at least give some sort of understanding of where these air handlers are in the building, because a lot of times we get that. We come in, well, I have a floor plan, I'm not sure where each one is. Again, Joe knows it, or if we walk around, we'll find it. We come in and we go through the building and we use a floor plan and actually markate where each of these air handlers are on the floor. So if there's an emergency and somebody like Joe isn't there, somebody who's new, somebody who hasn't really had much experience in the building, can quickly pull up that plan and say, oh wow, okay, there's AHU9, it's on the 3rd floor, run right up there and address it rather than going through files, trying to frantically call Mr. Joe here at 2 a.m. in the morning, right? So it's little things like that that we like to add too. Unfortunately, it is a common occurrence and it's okay, but it's one of the, the little items I like to mention, I think is so important when we're thinking about this is, yes, the air handler and everything as a whole, but also taking a step back and thinking about how this is going to affect facilities after we're done and how we can help them after we're done on a whole different level.
No, that's good. That's really good. And that's, basically what we were saying earlier is that we can help to develop a complete inventory, a more complete picture of everything besides just, name, rank, and serial number, right? Just nomenclature, age, where it's hooked up. And so I think that that's great. And it certainly is a help at every level. And of course, really what we're talking about here is just more than a visual inspection, which is what a lot of facility management folks do, perhaps, again, because they're short on time or short staffed, where they're just going to go in and open the door. Oh, it's time to check the filter. This looks good, ding, or put the new filter in. We're good, right? So we're really deep diving into these units, both from a hygiene or cleanliness standpoint and a performance standpoint as well. And again, I'll mention that ASHRAE 62.1 in Section 8 covers an operations and maintenance manual for this type of equipment and does more than recommend. I mean, it basically outlines the plan to look at over 27 components inside of this mechanical equipment and on a regular cadence, sometimes maybe once a year, sometimes once a quarter. So again, if you're not familiar with that standard, you would want to brush up on it, and certainly these type of assessments and deep diving into them are going to help really meet those guidelines. And so, Karl, when we're talking about more than just visual inspections, what are we looking at here?
Yeah, we're talking about utilizing sampling of different kinds to essentially tell us if we do see something that looks dusty or dirty, well, what's in it, right? Is this something that may be related to belt dust? It might be related to bypass through a filter, allowing things like pollen grains to accumulate. We also might be able to detect, hey, we do have microbial growth, right? And especially in a healthcare setting, if we detect a lot of that, that prompts us to say, hey, this is a serious concern now. We're trying to avoid HAI, so how do we do that? Let's clean this up. Let's remove that potential source. So absolutely, with the sampling side, we have that. And of course, we then have the performance side as well. Again, looking beyond just what we see, but how is it functioning? How is it actually affecting the space beyond the traditional indoor air quality in terms of microbial presence or what you're breathing in, but how you feel, the comfort levels.
Yeah, I mean, the performance aspect of this, Karl, is really, oftentimes we think about the types of work that test and balance certified technicians do, and we kind of lump them into a category that, okay, we'll deal with them when we're getting our building first opened or we're having a problem. But understanding the actual performance metrics of an air handler are just key. I mean, things like total static pressure, obviously pressure drop across the coil is one a lot of our facilities team members who are listening here in this audience know that that's a great indicator of whether the coil has a lot of impaction. But then you have other static pressure measurements that can be very valuable as you think about the type of data that collect in these assessments. Static pressure at the return, entering the air handler as the air enters from the outside air or the return air. If that static pressure is high, then you might have some kind of obstruction in the outside air or in the return duct. Things like closed damper, as we kind of alluded to before, or clogged air monitors, or what we talked about before, an outside air damper being closed. It's similar if you have a high static on the supply discharge when the air is leaving the air handler. That might be indicative of something clogged downstream in the supply duct work, whether it's a VAV box not opening, a failed actuator, dampers not opening, as we talked about, dirty duct work, turning vanes clogged, air monitors clogged. And so you gather that kind of data. It really tells you the story. There's interesting data when you get into things like, what's the RPM of the unit running at? And you compare that RPM, you know, to what it was designed to run at. And if it's not running at design, there might be some issue. You know, we might want to make some changes. You know, classic example is you take an RPM measurement and it's running below design, and you might want to make a change to the shiv size, especially if you're struggling to get air changes downstream. If it's those kind of situations where you're trying to achieve certain air changes, you may not realize you have more capacity in that air handler by doing some simple measurements with a tachometer. So you can go on, but the point is that performance data, referring to the types of testing that a test and balance technician would do on an air handler, are really valuable because you really understand how is that unit actually performing. And if you have the design data, you know, when it was originally installed, whether it was 10 years ago or 40 years ago, you can compare it against the design. But even if you don't, you at least have an idea of how it's actually running, using the laws of physics to give you true data about those kinds of scenarios.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. And each one of these categories that we look at and the differences between them, again, as we said, help paint a complete picture of what's going on, not only in each and every unit, but then across the entire inventory. And that's really where the rubber meets the road when we talk about bringing these kind of assessments back to the facilities team, back to the asset management and C-suite, is that they create very detailed and actionable reports. And so once all this data is gathered and analyzed and sampled, we're able to put it into a report that's easy to understand, but is still detailed, and that will really start to help make recommendations and further these plans and goals to bring this equipment back up to design, to fix any kind of critical maintenance issues that are in them. And so, guys, as we're sort of starting to draw this to a close, you know, talk about the value of these reports and the kind of granular detail that's in them that's beneficial to our stakeholders today.
I mean, to keep time conscious, you know, we obviously have an image up here, which is for an individual unit. And we kind of alluded to this earlier, each and every component being inspected. It's being graded on age and hygiene. So, and additional notes are being taken. And this is at, I don't want to say a basic level, but right, this is at a visual level only. So even just looking at the unit, all these different components are factored in, they're graded, and the sum total of them is then used to grade the overall unit. So when you're in the report, if you see exactly this image here, this table, which is great, you're able to then say, okay, I see ERU1, right? Number 28 there is in red. Why is it in red? So you can actually go back, see all these individual components and why it got that score, why and what happened. It may, you know, result in some items you can address and some items that, you know, we can address. So let's talk about that too. We have units in green, yellow, and red. What is the ultimate goal here? The ultimate goal is to get to green. Green meaning very little maintenance needed, keep up the good work, basic, you know, follow the basics, those things that we talked about with ASHRAE and our other webinars. Keep those going. But then we get into the other end, the red end. That's when we start to see advanced conditions replacement. The nice thing though is when you do an assessment like this, we're able to again do that keyword prioritize towards these red units now and say, hey, we need them to take prompt action here. And of course, there's the units that fall in between, the yellow. What's nice about the assessment is it takes these yellow units and outlines what is causing them to be yellow. And these units in yellow are the ones we can bring to green. So we have this ability to take these units kind of in that gray area, that in between, and bring them into that green by doing restoration, other sorts of maintenance that may be a little bit more specialized, but nonetheless achievable and feasible. So again, we're able to break down these units into these three categories and address them properly. And here's great one. Frank, I think you
yeah, I mean, just think back on what you're talking about, Karl, then, you know, you could take the red, yellow, green, or red, yellow, red, amber, green concept and extrapolate that just beyond the initial static data from that one-time snapshot. Because if you think about it, the red is the worst thing that could be, because that means you have a high capital expenditure to replace that particular asset. We're talking about air handlers here, but it could apply to anything. roofs and lots of different types of important assets. If you have a high red, that means you probably have more fires to put out. And just a natural, because that means that asset's in terrible shape and it needs to be replaced. But the less red you have, there's less fires to put out. So from a perspective of just stress every day in the facilities department, that's a big difference. I just had a call this week with a facilities team, and they were just completely at a loss, understaffed, and just unable to do what they want to do because they were short almost 20 people on their staff. It was ridiculous. And they're just not able to handle all the fires being thrown at them. And so they have a lot of red assets, and it's going to take some time and some really doing to knock down some of those reds. But the reason they're going to knock down some of those reds is because the executives and the board are interested in doing that because it's a great financial story for them. Because as you see here in this example, when you have just an example here, if you look at a set of air handlers, and about a third of them are in great shape, a little over half are in okay shape, and 13% more in red. They got some work to do there. And through replacements and through taking advantage of restoring the units that could be restored because they hadn't fallen into such disrepair that it was too late, you start attacking based on available capital budget every year, a little bit here, a little bit there, lower that red, and even again, lower that yellow. And now 4 or 5 years later is the projection. Now half the assets will be in green, great shape on the great preventive maintenance plan to keep them in green. And now we have less yellow and much less red, almost a seventh less red. And that's the key there. That's when you really start getting into a point where the financial story is really hitting home. And the asset managers and the board of directors look smart because that's, now you're really reaping the rewards of a great plan, and not incurring substantial capital costs anymore for replacements.
Those are all excellent points, and we often look at this like, what's your current state, and then where do you want to be? Like, where do you want to be in 3, 5, 10 years? And these reports, as you saw, just quick snapshots, right? Like of what maybe part of the individual unit report looks like, and how we take that data along with the other data to create a table of recommendations with this grading scale. And then the report goes even further to actually outline recommendations, especially if there's particular bioburden or microbial contaminants that are of concern. And we will do our best to make recommendations on how to actually start to get these units into the yellow and green state. And so this is just a quick sort of pros and cons list, if you will, or where you might be and where you could be. And I think a lot of this, Frank, you were just sort of talking about, but now we're starting to get into pros and cons, right? Like of where you're at. And so maybe you can sort of transition us from this sort of common scenario to a prescriptive strategy, and then we can just quickly touch on some of the prescriptive solutions that are available to include in these plans.
Yeah. I mean, it really just ties into the slide before, Troy and Karl, and this is trying to get to a point where our future state, which is the right-hand column, mimics that pie chart you saw on the bottom of the previous slide, which is you're minimizing those situations when you run the fail, you're minimizing the need for replacements. Of course, there always will be some replacements, but there won't be such a drastic a number of assets that have to be replaced in a given year and are on the verge of failure. And that's really where you get into a nice spot financially and planning wise to avoid all the things you see in the left column and get to a point where you're reducing risk, you're reducing capital outlays, and obviously that will also play a huge part in downstream in terms of comfort levels and complaints and less burden on your preventive maintenance team, and has a number of just great benefits after the plan's been implemented over the course of several years.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, obviously, we're talking about a piece of mechanical equipment. As we've alluded to earlier, just because that equipment's old doesn't mean that it needs to be replaced. In fact, there's a few new technologies that can be retrofit into existing cabinets, existing chilled water systems and evaporator coils that can greatly benefit from an engineering standpoint without the hassle of ripping off the entire unit from the roof or within a mechanical room, sometimes within a mechanical room that's not very easily accessed. And so that's when we start to get into these recommendations of, well, one, just cleaning, making sure the equipment's clean. And we have various proprietary high performance methods to do that. And then of course, just restoring the units. And so, you know, when we look at that, we do a pre and post performance assessment, whether we're cleaning or restoring it. And that's different from this larger data set that we're talking about. This is mainly for our field techs that would perform the work. They're going to go in and they're going to basically confirm how impacted the coil is, if they're getting airflow through the coil. And then as they go about cleaning and restoring the unit, they will check in with that impaction data and to see, you know, what kind of difference is being made to airflow. So when we talk about a pre and post performance assessment, we're talking about a very specialized one that our field techs are using to basically grade themselves on the job. But, you know, the benefits of this restoration, and of course, we've covered it quite a bit in past workshops, and I'm sure we'll touch on it again in future workshops. Of course, we have handouts today that give you detailed information on all of these. But look, you know, what we're talking about here is increasing the useful lifespan of this asset through cleaning it, restoring performance, restoring cleanliness, you know, sanitizing it, right? And what we have found, and there's plenty of case studies and white papers on our website, pureaircontrols.com, that talk to this, but we see a fairly quick payback with energy savings just from cleaning the coils with our steam coil cleaning method. And it's not uncommon that we would see a 1 1/4 year payback on some of these heavily impacted coils, ones that we're getting 30, 45% better airflow through. And of course, the improvement in indoor air quality and how that affects the occupants in the building, students, teachers, staff, you know, nurses, doctors, right, administrators. We typically see that these kind of restorations are 10 to 40% the cost of a total replacement. And that, you know, depends on a variety of factors, as Frank and Karl have talked about earlier. And that's, you know, do we need to replace some dampers? Do we need to do a few things where we're actually doing more than just cleaning it and perhaps painting it? But, you know, or it would include maybe retrofitting it, like the bottom set of pictures there, with a brand new fan wall or fan array, which helps to build redundancy into the system. So if one fan should fail, the other fans in the array will ramp up and you never lose the unit. So the unit never goes down. So, you know, these type of things are going to sort of slide that restoration cost around. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's much more affordable and much more sustainable than just replacing units because they're old. And of course, because the unit has been restored and recommissioned and the useful lifespan of the asset has been increased, you can recapitalize it. So much of this restoration can be procured through capital expenditure budgets. So it's not just a matter of procuring through maintenance, but now you can actually use capital budgets to restore this equipment and bring it back up to its efficiencies. And of course, as I said, it's sustainable. There's less disruption to the facility. You're not recycling or breaking down the old unit. You're not trucking in cranes and trucking in the new units. So it really creates a restore in place, sustainable type of upcycling for this equipment for a circular economy. And I started to sort of talk about that process, but you know, Frank, why don't you just quickly run us through this process of restoration and what it looks like from our end?
Yeah, I mean, you see here 6 steps and what may be a typical air handler restoration. I don't like to use the word typical really because every air handler tells its own story. It's really just based on the air handler condition assessment and then the factors I talked about earlier. What does it serve? What's appropriate in terms of investment back into that air handler because of the criticality of the area it serves, or because of its location, because it can't be perhaps replaced because it's in such a poor location that it would be extremely expensive to set the logistics to replace it. Maybe a tight mechanical room, maybe a difficult to access roof area. So every air handler restoration is different, but this is one that's fairly common. You know, start out with a deep cleaning of the air handler, all components of the air handler, including the blower and the coil, and the internal cabinets. The coil has a high static pressure drop across it, or it has some physical damage, or leaking or whatnot, then the coil is just replaced instead of being cleaned. But if it's not in such a condition where we don't think we can get great airflow across the coil from our process, then we're going to keep that process up. And of course, you want to do all the types of things you want to do to get the air handler prepped. Remove as much rust as you can. Do any kind of patch and seal and repair necessary. And that part of it's also dictated a lot by location. You know, that can get labor intensive, but if you have a location where it's worth putting the time in to put a new floor in the air handler, then so be it. So all that can play a part in it. And then we look into priming and applying protective coatings to the unit. The purpose of the coatings is to, again, sustain that metallic component part equipment, sustain it, prevent the rust from coming back, and also have antimicrobial properties to the coating as well. So it provides a double benefit. And then of course, for older air handlers, particularly you see they're single wall and they have the fiberglass insulation exposed on the inside, like we saw in some of the photographs previously. That should definitely be removed, replaced with a closed cell material that's non-porous. So you don't have the risk of microbial growth and the risk of fiberglass particles pulling off from age and degradation. And in many cases, we'll also seal and coat the exterior of the unit in both mechanical room and rooftop scenarios. And as you've seen here, you know, fan array retrofits. Fan array retrofit where the air handler blower compartment's removed and a fan array or fan wall, some folks call it, is retrofitted in that existing blower compartment.
If I can interject you too, you know, just for everybody watching from a facility standpoint too, I know we're talking about these steps and different aspects of hygiene, but again, the little things that I always like to point out too, when we're going from the assessment to actually applying some of these, as Frank said, not every air handler is the same, but if you steam clean several units, don't just think of it as the unit itself, but what effect does that have down the line on your chiller? Just as one example, right? How expensive are chillers? How expensive are compressors? As we start to do things like cleaning, thinking of it beyond just what you're looking at with the air handler, but how the other systems are affected in energy, in life. The same thing can be said about the fan arrays. I always have this conversation of when you start putting in these fan arrays, you're getting rid of belts. You're getting rid of greasing, not just the cost of belts, but think about the man hours a typical facilities team puts into belts and greasing. You know, just think about that, multiply it out, and then think about all the other tasks, because we all know there's probably a lot of tasks on a lot of people's plates in this webinar. Where can you use that time otherwise, right? And time is money. So, you know, again, just kind of thinking about the little things, the side items, how that all plays into a restoration and cleaning, and why it's more than just what you're looking at right there at the air handler level.
Yeah, no, those are absolutely great points, because every little thing adds up, and that's kind of it really is what we're talking about here when we talk about looking at all of these component parts and all of the categories that affect this equipment, right down to what it's going to take to restore it. And of course, you know, it's not just the air handler units. You've heard some of the stories from the field that we have covered today, but it's also, you know, the air conveyance system and the ductwork and equipment that's in the ductwork. So, you know, again, all of this is important. So as we work through the data that these reports bring to the table, of course, we're going to find things that probably need to be pointed up within the air conveyance system as well, because again, it's a holistic system that can easily have a domino effect created. If one thing goes wrong and is not addressed, it starts to create other problems in other places. So, you know, Karl, again, quickly, and then we're going to wrap this up and take a few questions. I see a few coming in. Why don't you just sort of take us through the importance of how these things are symbiotic. You address the chillers and maybe compressors, which would, service the actual AHUs. Now let's talk about the air conveyance system from and back to those AHUs.
Right. Yeah, and Frank hit upon it very nicely earlier from one aspect, which is just alone, terminal units, the VAV boxes. When's the last time they've been calibrated or checked? And what happens when they do get dirty or they fail or the calibration goes off? And that's a classic that why we do these performance assessments is because sometimes we can learn at the air handler level through static pressure profile and several other techniques. Hey, something's going on downstream and these units are fouled up, they're dirty. So not only is it a hygienic thing, but now it's a performance thing. It's going back to the air handler. So, not just cleaning them, but looking at replacement parts that are broken. Really, again, hitting this from a performance and hygiene standpoint. And with that said, I to keep it quick, I always just say the low bid isn't the best bid when it comes to duct cleaning. It seems straightforward, but how often is you, a manager, an owner, are you looking in the ductwork? How often can somebody just breeze through, say, hey, here's a few photos, trust me. It happens, unfortunately, but to do it right, it's a combination of containment, of negative pressure, of HEPA filtration. It's containing a zone. Anything that comes through that ductwork is out, it's filtered correctly, and it's covering that entirety, turning vanes, VAVs, and other terminal units, reheat coils. I mean, there are other components in there, and you have to just work with somebody who's going to take that whole system, put it right in front of you, say, look, we're taking care of it from start to finish, all things included. Here's our detailed approach. Here's where we identify everything for you, because that is ultimately, the way to do it. Make that investment, get it done, because if it's done right, you shouldn't have to worry about what happens a year from now, or why is something discharging from my ductwork, right? So again, that's just kind of my 2 cents on duct cleaning. It's more meticulous than it looks, and it should be more meticulous than it looks.
Oh, absolutely. Well, folks, I do want to thank all of you for your patience and hanging in there with us. Almost all of you are still here after 1 hour, so I applaud you. I know it's good information, and it's going to be a lot of food for thought as you walk away from this workshop today. Just really quickly, and many of you are repeat students, if you will, or customers and clients, and we thank you for that. But for the folks that don't know us too well, these services were founded in 1984, so we're not some fly-by pandemic company. We've been around, we're built to last, so much so that last year we were acquired by RPM International and placed with Weatherproofing Technologies Incorporated. That's who we are now, offering these services as part of the Trimco Construction Products Group. So now we're part of that larger family and ready to service you. And with that, we do have these 3 specialized divisions and 1 product division. And each one of these divisions has a role to play in all of this reporting and testing, and of course, the remedial efforts. So that's our building sciences team, our environmental diagnostics laboratory, and then our building remediation sciences team. And of course, we do have building health check. And they're a product provider of do-it-yourself testing kits, air purification units, IAQ monitoring devices. So all told, we're focused on health, comfort, and energy efficiency for your buildings, and that has amounted to over 900 million square feet in those amount of years, over 18,000 building serviced. So healthcare, education, commercial government, we really don't do residential or homes. We're looking at big campuses, big units, and pretty vast inventories that we're trying to take care of here. And so with that, we do have a couple of questions. And of course, I'd like to thank Frank Santini and Karl Stefan today. Here's all of our contact information. And if we don't get to your question today, feel free to ask in the survey that you take at the end of the workshop when you exit, or just email or call us. We're always happy to share knowledge and help you all out. So with that, guys, we have a couple questions. We have Oren Grinnell, and I think I've said that right. And he says, hello, I'm new to HVAC, and he's currently a lead inspector and an inspector for HVAC systems. He goes, but he knows that there's a lot more to it than just inspecting. So besides the IMC, UPC, and SMA CNA standards, are there any inspection checklists overall and commissioning requirements? And he says he also knows that he'll need to study up on load calculations. He's been more on the construction side before he's had the opportunity to work with HVAC. So, what kind of advice could we give him as an HVAC inspector? Maybe Karl, since this is your area of expertise, of other certifications or standards and guidance to look for?
Well, I was going to say, Troy, is the ASHRAE 62.1 checklist that we referenced earlier in the slideshow.
Yeah, ASHRAE is ideal for. I mean, we talk about it on how many webinars, Troy, and that checklist, the level of detail. I mean, you could get into ductwork, never forget referencing things like NACA and looking into, I mean, you've nailed a couple of the other certifications right there. I mean, it's, one of the big things, again, I mentioned earlier, is just, when's the last time you looked at like a retro commission of the VAVs, right? And looking into more than just the hygiene, but the performance, the functionality, and then again, with the unit, I mean, 62.1 puts just so much good information out there. I usually say that's a great one to reference.
If that gentleman's not familiar with that, that's American Society of Heating and Refrigeration Engineers. ASHRAE is the acronym.
And to be clear, the bulk of that standard is to calculate ventilation rates for optimal IAQ. But there's a good chunk in the middle that really talks about the operation and maintenance of this type of equipment, and then how that affects ventilation and IAQ. So it really is sort of sandwiched right in all of that good information and engineering information on how to calculate ventilation rates to optimize IAQ. So yeah, definitely ANSI, ASHRAE is where I would start. And of course, there's many other standards relative to mechanical operations. We have our colleague and good friend, David Reynolds from IFMA, International Facility Management Association, asking, regarding healthcare, does the Joint Commission give attention to indoor air quality and HVAC performance during accreditation projects?
Yeah, good question. I mean, as far as when I think about the hygiene aspect of that, I have gotten a couple calls recently following a Joint Commission inspection in which they were, in both cases, it was surgery suites. They were dinged for having a layer of dust on the supply side ductwork. And I had not heard that before. So it makes me think the Joint Commission inspectors are paying more attention to ductwork hygiene. So I will say that. I don't know if that's a formal policy of theirs or just more awareness because of the pandemic. Go ahead, Karl, if you want to say anything.
Right, I would say certainly air handlers. I mean, I've worked with numerous clients that if the Joint Commission starts opening up these air handlers to take a look, it could be some serious trouble if they see basic signs of accumulation and fouling, regardless of your final filters. So yeah, they will look at your air handlers.
Yeah, that's good. That's good information. We had one other question, and that is, generally speaking, if I have a large campus of buildings with air handlers, am I taking care of that building by building and getting the report or assessment, or is it one overall assessment for all of the buildings and their air handlers?
Yeah, great question. I mean, the ideal situation is to assess the entire inventory of air handlers, and then you can break down the reports in a fashion that makes the most sense. Building by building is typically to that questioner's point is typically the way to do that. And then to my point earlier, if it's obviously a very large inventory, you want to build in a process for reassessment after a period of time for the air handlers that were not addressed in the first aspect of the plan. So you can have updated data on some of those units, but you don't know what units they are until after you do the initial assessment. So you can really prioritize based on a full view of your entire air handler inventory.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, and of course, and we didn't get into it today, and really this was more an educational session. But I do know that some of the best-in-class warranties that we're going to offer as our customers and partners undertake these type of assessment and restoration programs will sort of build in those kind of check-ins, right, Frank, to be able to, sort of come back through and reassess certain pieces of equipment after, a number of years.
That's right, Troy. Yeah, so once the program is rolling, then we're going to build in those types of warranty program and inspection programs, not only for the air handlers that were already refurbished, but to your point, the air handlers that are still part of the program that are a couple years down the line because they weren't as high priority based on the initial results of the assessment.
No, that's great. So, folks, it doesn't look like we have any more questions. We kept you maybe 5 minutes longer than we wanted to, but yet, 48 of you are still on with us, and we can't thank you enough. As you know, we operate and do these IAQ Matters online workshops and expert panels. Of course, we have a weekly newsletter that we put out that includes a weekly news article on our blog. So stay tuned to all of these channels for future seminars and expert panels. And again, on behalf of Frank and Karl and WTI Pure Air Control Services, I thank you for joining us today.